Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Snaggle and Thor slept, both warmed against the December night by the other's body heat and the orange twinkling embers of a dying fire. Visions of the large chicken that the humans would be cooking soon were dancing in their heads. But what Snaggle really wanted, and dared to hope for every time this strange part of the year came around, was what the humans of his pack called steak. With chicken, the humans shared freely when they would bring the bird home fully cooked. Sometimes they would have two, one to share with him. Those were some of the best days. In the time since he and Thor had battled the bad creature, their humans had given them lots of chicken. Snaggle even licked his chops when he dared to dream of a nice juicy steak. He had been quick enough to snatch a dropped morsel on a few rare occasions, and it was the most heavenly food he could imagine. But most times, he had to settle for just the wonderful smell of it being cooked, while a feast for his nose, it left his belly wanting. Sure, Thor would roll his eyes whenever Snaggle brought up the subject of steak. He always reminded Snaggle that it was one of the tasty things that their humans never shared with them. Snaggle hated Thor's insistence on this point whenever he would fantasize about a full serving of the yummy meat. Krampus's hooves crunched in the snow as he made his way through the woods. The bitter cold Midwestern December night was nothing compared to his homeland in the Austrian Central Alps. This part of Missouri always made him nostalgic for home. Many Germanic farmers settled here, and while not his beloved Austria, it was close enough to trigger nostalgia. He had once been a fur-clad man by the name of Belsnickel. He was not treated kindly by his village and mocked for having an abnormally long tongue, even though in private, many of the ladies had found it titillating. Ooh. But his life changed when St. Nicholas offered him a position as a servant. Initially, it had been a good life, a step up from his peasant origins, but his duties changed over time. It all started when his lord began requiring assistance with Christmas Eve. If children knew their prayers and were well behaved, his master would give them a sweet or present. However, the task of leaving coal or giving a birch rod beating to the children St. Nicholas deemed unworthy fell to him. Eventually, the joy that good children felt toward Belsnickel's lord changed the other man. He grew less stern and more jolly, his name changing along with his temperament. He went from the formal St. Nicholas to the more familiar Nick, before at last settling upon Santa Claus. He took a wife, a scarlet-haired beauty Belsnickel loved the moment he set eyes on her, but thinking she would have nothing to do with a saint's lowly manservant, he never approached her. Whereas the years had been kind to Santa Claus, they had not been kind to Belsnickel. His jealousy over his lord's marriage to the woman of his dreams, along with the anger over increasingly ill-behaved children, ate at his soul. Slowly, but almost imperceptibly, the furs he had worn became indistinguishable from his sinewy body. The children's fear contrasted with their cruel taunts of "servant devil" caused his form to morph. His feet hardened into hooves, his face grew gaunt and narrow. Horns pierced the skin on the crown of his head. His long tongue and his duties were the only parts of Belsnickel, the man that remained. Even his name evolved into something darker, Krampus. For centuries, he slaved under Santa Claus, doing the dirty jobs the jolly fat bastard was too good to do. Santa was celebrated with feasts, while Krampusnacht, in the few places it was celebrated, involved young men parading through the streets dressed as him to terrify children and engage in the very debauchery he was sworn to punish. While Santa got milk and cookies left over from his festivities, Krampus just got more work. And this year the children were especially bad, and Krampus had had enough. Supply chain issues were the straw that broke Rudolph's back. He ran out of coal in the mid-Missouri town of Herman. "I have come here to give coal and birch beatings," he said as he got into Santa's sleigh, "and I'm all out of coal." The asshole behind the reins merely shrugged his shoulders as he shoved another cookie in his face. I don't know. Give them all beatings? You are Krampus after all. Bad children are your specialty, Santa had said before laughing the problem off. Ho ho ho! Why don't you ever punish the bad ones? Maybe at this next house we swap, Krampus gets to be the good guy once, he practically pleaded. Santa just stared at his assistant. No, he said without any semblance of his usual jolliness as the sleigh took off. Santa was often obnoxious and had always hated getting his hands dirty by punishing the bad children. Just once, Krampus insisted defiantly. I'll quit if you don't let me at least fill one good child's stocking, or you put just one piece of coal in a bully's stocking. Bell's nickel. Don't make promises you can't keep. Something was off this Christmas, and Krampus could tell from Santa's tone that whatever was bothering the bastard was being taken out on him. You can't just quit. Where will you go? Your home is the North Pole, and the human world is not kind to supernatural beings, especially ones who, sorry to be blunt, look like a monster like you. Santa sighed. Your future is with the Claus family, whether we like it or not. Something snapped in Krampus. Tired of being the monster, he grabbed the fat fuck and forced the jolly elf into his own magical sack. After securing the bag, he reached for the reins to pilot the sleigh. Unfortunately, reindeer were stubbornly loyal. Having none of the hijacking, they landed in a clearing near a humble home on the outskirts of the village of Leesburg, Missouri. He tossed the wiggling bag into the snow before jumping off it himself. The reindeer immediately took off, stranding him and his hostage. Happy holidays to you too, you bunch of ingrates, he yelled as Rudolph's blinking nose disappeared into the distance. Krampus had to act fast. The sleigh would make it to the North Pole and back quickly, and filled with a squad of elite emergency response elves. Let me out of here, you naughty devil! Santa shouted from his magical prison, causing Krampus to drop his burden. Oof! Krampus pulled a birch switch from the quiver he kept on his back and began swatting the lumpy form of Santa Claus. Quiet! Let me think! He yelled, stopping only after Santa had indeed gone quiet. He needed a plan. Thankfully, he had seen a house nearby. There were 4 adults and 2 dogs, but no children. While he and his kidnapped companion were immortal, they were not invincible. In this part of the country, he knew people kept personal armories full of high-powered hunting rifles and other weapons. He and Santa carried fairy dust that kept parents deep asleep. If some meddlesome adult was up and about, they could use the dust to mesmerize them and convince them to go to bed. While he had never tried anything of the sort before, Krampus figured it would be easy to make one of these adults kill Santa in their sleep. That way, he could make his escape, and they would have to deal with the elf assassins Mrs. Claus would be sending after him. If everything worked out for him, he'd find a tropical island and live out the rest of eternity in peace, the world continuing to spin just fine without him. Snaggle perked up as he heard steps outside and smelled a scent he hadn't smelled in a long time. His alphas had once had a pup, but she had gotten sick and passed. Once a year, 2 humans, one that smelled more like an animal and the other big and oozing goodness, would stop by, and the good one would leave presents that made the human pup squeal in glee. She was happy, but it made Snaggle's ears hurt. Yet it was worth it, as the big, oozy good human would leave him a nice bone with bits of meat steadfastly clinging to it. Sometimes he even gave Snaggle a new squeaky toy. The scent of the animal man was strong, but the big human's scent was weak. The sound of hooves clomping on the porch steps got Snaggle's tail wagging as he rose to his 3 paws. He let out a long, soft bark that roused Thor from his slumber. The sound and unfamiliar scent raised Thor's hackles. Thor whimpered, "Why, tail wagging. Stranger danger." "Good strangers. Bring presents," Snaggle barked back. Thor's hackles lowered and his fur laid flat as he sauntered over to Snaggle and plopped down next to him. His tail remained still as the door opened, a cold wind blowing snow into the house. The tall figure of a horned, fur-covered human cast a shadow across the dogs. Snaggle's tail stopped wagging when he didn't see the jolly companion he had smelled. A hoof thumped against the hardwood floor as the figure tentatively stepped into the house. It looked down upon the dogs, regarding them for a second before fully entering. Snaggle and Thor stood and followed the intruder into the kitchen, their tails tucked between their legs. Snaggle wasn't sure what to make of the situation, but he watched the intruder's every move. The furry man dropped a large wiggling sack on the kitchen floor. The man then reached for something he carried on the collar he wore around his hips. It looked like a treat bag, which made both dogs' tails wag. The intruder dumped something into his hand and blew it into Snaggle and Thor's faces, causing them to sniffle. Snaggle's head began to swim and his vision to blur. There seemed to be two of the furry man, and he could hear scents and smell sounds. But it was only briefly, for when he shook his head, everything went back to normal. Ever since his and Thor's encounter with the small, large-eyed humans who helped defeat the bad creatures, they could more easily shake off unpleasantness. It came in handy when dealing with the skunk-smelling cigarettes Thor's alpha had a habit of smoking. Even things like getting a burr stuck in their paws rarely hurt like they used to, and Snaggle's joints hardly ached anymore. "Snuggle? Is that you?" The muffled voice of the large, happy man who brought bones and squeaky toys came from the bag, startling the two dogs. "It's Santa. You've been a very good boy. Get me out of here and I promise you and Thor a very special Christmas present." Snaggle looked at his pack mate, then the sack, then the furry human. He bared his teeth and began barking, charging the strange man who let out a yelp and started running deeper into the house. Seconds later, Thor was barking and had joined the chase toward the back door. The intruder hit the dead end, giving Snaggle a chance to bite him on the butt. "Overdumpt!" the furry man screamed. "Krampus! Language!" Santa exclaimed from his prison of magical burlap. Snaggle and Thor snarled at the intruder as he fumbled with the back door knob for a few moments, but he got it unlocked and rushed outside into the cold Christmas Eve night. Satisfied, the canine pair pranced back to the wiggling sack and began sniffing it. Snaggle watched as Thor began tugging at a string. His friend could never resist playing tug. Snaggle was skeptical, but to his surprise, the rope loosened and slipped off, letting the sack open. A very disheveled Santa Claus emerged. Snaggle plopped down and cocked his head, looking at the familiar man standing in front of him. He watched Thor take the rope as a prize and retreat to his bed to chew on it. "Good boy, Snaggle," Santa said, patting his head before making his way to Thor's bed to tussle with the black lab. Snaggle lay down and watched the show. He knew Thor thought it was a game, but he wasn't sure about Santa. "What the hell?" The sound of Snaggle's alpha made him lift his head. Thor's alpha stood next to Snaggle's, and both held the boomsticks that hurt their ears. However, after they had tangled with the bad creatures, Snaggle had acquiesced that they were a necessary evil. "Ho, ho, ho!" Santa laughed as he dropped his end of the rope. "Glenn, Richard, so happy to see you. Have you been good children this year?" Neither human spoke, even when the door opened and a woman dressed in a dark brownish-gray outfit matching Santa's entered. "Nicholas Christopher Kringle," she said as she flew into his arms. "You gave us all a dreadful fright." "Oh, Jessica, it's just Krampus. He went a little too far this year, but Mrs. Claus is a ginger?" Thor's human exclaimed. "You look nothing like your pictures," Snaggle's human chimed in. Snaggle was getting a little suspicious about his human's behavior. Santa and Mrs. Claus were good, but humans typically weren't good judges of character. That's why dogs made an alliance with them. They were helped by a dog's sense of danger, and canines got food they didn't have to hunt for, with chicken and the occasional drop piece of steak as special bonuses. Mrs. Claus chuckled. "I would say that we get that a lot, but most good boys are fast asleep when Santa makes his deliveries. What say I go tuck you good boys in?" "Giggity," Thor's human said, unable to help himself. "Oh, Glenn," she said, pulling something from Santa's belt. As she poured some of the contents into her hand, Snaggle recognized it as what the furry human had blown in his and Thor's face. Now you don't want to be a bad boy, do you? Mrs. Claus blew a cloud of the dust in the humans' faces before Glenn could speak again. Snaggle cocked his head, trying to figure out what he was seeing. Their humans had fallen asleep but were still standing. Mrs. Claus guided them upstairs. Santa picked up his rope, discarded by a mesmerized Thor while the scene unfolded, and went to his sack. There was a soft knock at the door just as Mrs. Claus came back downstairs. She opened the door and two little men entered. "Yes, Hermes and Maxwell? Has Noel found Krampus yet?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Hermes reported. "He covered his tracks," Maxwell added. "Noel is here?" Santa asked as he stepped over to Snaggle and Thor. "And you activated the emergency lifesaver force?" "Of course, darling." Santa gave the two dogs scratches. "Would you boys want to help Santa's daughter and elves find that mean old Krampus? I'll leave you something special." Snaggle looked at Thor, who rolled his eyes, knowing no argument for staying cozy in the warm house would do. They once more rose to their paws and followed one of the small men outside. He pulled out a candy cane and spoke into it. "Songbird, this is Dentist. We've got two very good boys joining us to sniff out broken birch. Plumber and I are joining the hunt." "Copy." Songbird's voice was clear to Snaggle's acute hearing. She sounded like a younger version of Mrs. Claus. "The tracks went cold at the wood line. I hope you're talking about the puppies in the house and not the boys who live there. I checked everyone's names against Santa's lists. The dogs are really good boys. The wives are absolute angels. And Rich is okay. Glenn, though..." Songbird's voice trailed. "Yes, ma'am. We've got the puppers," Dentist responded. "Meet me out back." Krampus ran, the snow crunching under his hooves. He hated winter. The snow always clung to his fur and made him cold everywhere. Living in Santa's domain meant he had to suffer winter all year long. Krampus often wondered if relocation to a warmer climate might give him a sunnier disposition. He would soon find out because he had no choice but Mexico. He had read about the Mayan ruins at Chichen Itza, and it sounded like an amazing magical place. Yes, the Yucatan would be where he started a new life. He closed his eyes and imagined watching the spring and autumn equinoxes play their tricks of light and shadow, casting the illusion of the feathered serpent god Kukulkan crawling down the steep stairs of the temple of Kukulkan pyramid. The barking of dogs pulled him from his dreams of freedom. "Verdant!" he growled as he pushed deeper into the woods. He doubted anyone from the small village was chasing him. These had to be the best of the emergency life-saving force led by none other than Noel Klaus. The thought of Santa's daughter made Krampus's heart beat that much faster. As she became a woman, he had fallen in love with her like her mother before her. But her father had been born in 270 AD and lacked the egalitarian impulses of the modern world. Despite Noel's admission to her father that the attraction was mutual, he would not allow his daughter to date a lowly manservant, especially one wildly mocked by elves and children alike as Santa's shadow or the Christmas demon. The barking of the meddlesome dogs drew nearer and brought his focus back to his escape. He pushed himself to run farther, but he felt his magic failing him. Each breath began to burn his lungs, and the pounding of paws beating on the snow-covered ground was almost upon him. There was a snarling growl as canine jaws nipped at his shins before the three-legged one once more managed to sink teeth into his butt. A lyrical feminine voice pierced the icy air. "Belsnickel! Freeze!" Noel's voice galvanized him to find the energy to run faster. He heard a loud pop, similar to the noise of a champagne bottle being uncorked. In an instant, he found himself bound in magical tinsel from his torso down to his ankles. He fell, landing face down in the snow. Snaggle had done it. With Thor's help, they had led the woman and her strange short companions to the bad man who had invaded the sanctity of their den and kidnapped the jolly man with delicious presents. They circled him after the woman had shot the furry man with a strange boomstick, bringing him down but not seeming to hurt him much. However, Snaggle felt the jerk still needed to be taught a lesson about home invasion and kidnapping, so he lifted his phantom leg over that of their prey. This elicited laughter from the two small males who followed the woman. However, she had the same disappointed expression Snaggle's alpha female usually had when he had an accident inside the house. "It's okay, Snaggle," she said with an exasperated sigh. "You and Thor are good boys. Hurry home. Santa has a special present for each of you." Neither dog had to be told twice, and they began sprinting home. Krampus struggled against his tinsel bonds and only grew more pissed off by the way they twinkled in the full moon. The sound of boots crunching in the snow made him still as the maddening laughter from the elves assaulted his ears. "Dentist, plumber, show some respect," Noelle commanded, causing the pair to go silent. She knelt in the snow next to his face. He turned his head, not wanting to face her as the reality of everything he had thrown away weighed him down. He felt her hands petting his fur. "Oh, my sweet Belsnickel, why this year of all years?" Her voice was soft, a little sad. Krampus grunted, irritated by her touch, but unable to get away from it. I told him all I wanted for Christmas was you," Noelle admitted. Krampus turned to face her. "Please, Noelle. Don't be cruel and tease me." He searched her face and found a tear sliding down her cheek. "It's no tease. I know there's good in you, that what you do is for the greater good. It takes a lot of character to guide children away from naughtiness." She continued to stroke his fur. "It's much easier to give good children sweets and presents." "But I'm just a lowly manservant, and you're the princess of the North Pole." She chuckled sweetly. "Times change, attitudes change, and my father can change, albeit slowly." The sound of sleigh bells could be heard in the distance. "Come, let me free you so we can go home and fix this." Snaggle watched as Thor pushed the door to his den open, and the pair was met with the delightful scent of steak. Snaggle's tail began to wag happily. He looked at his friend. Thor simply lowered his gaze. "Don't get your hopes up." Snaggle decided to ignore his packmate and pushed into the house. There was no sign Santa had ever been there besides cookie crumbs, an empty glass of milk, and 2 dog bowls filled with chunks of medium-rare ribeye steaks.
Last week, I was alone in my bed. I'm not alone tonight. He's right next to me. He's not supposed to be here, though. Last week, I was a senior in high school and completely in love with Stephen Hooverson. Truth be told, I've been in love with Stephen for years. He was always handsome and popular. I've never been popular. I was an only child, and my mom spent most of her time bouncing from one man's bed to another, usually in a meth-fueled haze. I was often alone for days in our dilapidated trailer. We didn't even have pets. We couldn't afford them. Besides, there were always strays running around the trailer park. A few times, I would drag in some mange-riddled puppy or scrawny kitten, and when my mother finally noticed, she would yell about having another mouth to feed before tossing the animal out the door. As I got older, I would hide the puppy or kitten for a few days. Before my mom could find them, I would smother them under a pillow or drown them in the bathtub. I buried their little bodies under the trailer. That way, I could visit the small mounds of dirt if I was feeling particularly lonely. I was alone at school too, of course. You wouldn't think someone could be lonely surrounded by a classroom full of people your own age, but you'd be wrong. Children have a special way of making someone like me miserable. My clothes were usually dirty or tattered, my hair hanging in greasy strings around my face. It's hard to keep up appearances with donated clothes you couldn't even keep clean, because the water was often shut off. My classmates would tease me, call me smelly and that grubby girl, and avoid me. Their whispers and giggles trailed after me, as close and familiar as my own shadow. High school kids can be especially cruel. Boys would pretend to flirt with me on a dare. If I ever gave the slightest hint I believed their compliments, they would burst into laughter, running back to their group of friends waiting a few feet away, all of them pointing and doubled over laughing. I hated the stupid sound of their hyena yapping. I learned to keep to myself and avoid talking to anyone. Most of the time, everyone acted like I was invisible. The only good thing about being invisible was being able to watch Steven. When he passed by me in the hallways, I could smell his body wash. My eyes would trail after him, drinking in every detail of the way he moved. How his clothes hugged his muscular body, his brilliant smile. In class, I would watch him rub the back of his head when a test question was frustrating. My fingers would twitch on my desk, aching to run my fingers through his hair. Last week, I was tired of being alone. The 27 dirt mounds under the trailer were not enough. I wanted to be with a person. I wanted Steven. It was the week before Valentine's Day. I watched stupid girls giggling as they passed pink cards out to their idiot friends. I watched boyfriends surprise their girlfriends with the standard boring boxes of candy. Even the damn teachers would find gifts on their desks. On Thursday, February 12th, I decided I wouldn't be alone on Valentine's Day. I skipped school and took a bus downtown. I remembered the area from a time when my mother would drag me with her to score drugs. There was a woman in a rundown apartment building who would read palms and whip up hexes and potions. I had some money stashed away from my after-school job flipping hamburgers. The woman's name was Tamra, or Miss Tam Tam. She always gave me the creeps. I remember the night she grabbed me by the shoulders and stared into my eyes. I was in the 3rd grade. My mom had brought me to the building to meet up with a dealer. Mom had hissed at me to keep quiet and not touch anything. As we climbed the dingy stairs, we passed Miss Tam Tam. Her skirts were billowing out behind her with each descending step. My hand involuntarily reached out to caress the colorful silk. Before I knew it, steel talons sank into my shoulders and whirled me around. Sharp, almost black eyes pierced my face. "What you know about me, child?" Her voice purred like a cat, but there was an undercurrent of hatred and malice. I stammered, my mouth gaping as the air in my throat leaked out, forming no words, only soft grunts. "Never mind this idiot girl, Miss Tam Tam. We're just meeting up with Eddie." My mother laughed, her voice small and shaking. Mother pulled me away from Miss Tam Tam. "I see you again, child." Miss Tam Tam laughed. "You'll need something, and I'll give it, but you won't like it." Again she cackled, and with a flourish of silks, she continued down the stairs, her humorless chuckles echoing off the peeling walls. I watched her disappear behind a door spray-painted with a neon green skull. Years later, Miss Tam Tam's warning repeated in my head as I stepped off the bus in front of the crumbling apartment building. I waved my hands around my ears as if I could brush the memory of her words away like a troublesome moth. A man was sitting on the building steps, sipping dark brown liquid from a bottle wrapped in a crinkled paper bag. I stepped past him, holding my breath to block out the musky smell of his body odor, and pulled open the door to the 1st floor hallway. A fluorescent light pulsed overhead with a buzzing hum. The flickering light bathed the cracked gray walls in cool light and only deepened the corner shadows. Though it was mid-morning, the hallway seemed dark and sepulchral. I walked up the staircase to the 3rd floor, where I found the same glowing green skull, faded, but still menacing, on a battered door. I raised my hand to knock, but before my knuckles could land on the wood, the door slowly creaked open. There was a swampy smell mingled with a metallic scent of blood. Miss Tamtam's smooth voice slithered from the darkness beyond the door. "Here you are again, child. Look how you've grown. Come in." I stepped in, and the door closed behind me with a soft click. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I could see the apartment was a studio. Really just one large room with a small bathroom tucked away in the corner. What could have been the living room held a small round table with 2 chairs. On the table was a deck of cards and a long, twisting knife. All along the apartment walls were shelves full of jars, strange plants, a few tattered books, and what looked like small bones. The makeshift kitchen was situated on the other side of the room. A large steel pot bubbled on a hot plate set up on a broken dresser. Miss Tamtam stood next to the pot, slowly stirring, her back to me. I slid my backpack off my shoulders and pulled out all the money I had, $100. I gripped the wad of cash in my fist and cleared my throat. I need a potion, I said. Do you do that? Miss Tamtam turned to look at me, nodding twice. I don't know how, but she looked even taller than when I first saw her when I was a kid. She stepped towards me, and I couldn't help but shrink back against the door. "Yes, I do." Her voice was clipped, and her black eyes bore into mine. She stopped only a foot away. Thought I could hear the sound of a swarm of bees from somewhere in the room. The soft buzzing pulsed in time with my heartbeat. "A love potion?" I asked. Miss Tamtam threw her head to the side and spat violently onto the stained carpet. Her face twisted with scorn, and she shot forward, closing the distance between us, only inches away. Her lips curled into a sneer, revealing mottled yellow teeth. "Love," the words spewed out of her mouth. Slimy droplets of spit flicked onto my face. "Stupid child. You sure? You think that's what you need?" I straightened, willing myself not to blink, and raised the money to my chest. "I'm not going to be alone anymore." Miss Tamtam grunted and took the money from my hand. I exhaled slowly and closed my eyes in an effort to slow down my heartbeat, thumping wildly in my chest as she turned towards the kitchen area. I could hear pots banging and Miss Tamtam muttering to herself. My eyes flew open at once as a terrifying idea flooded my brain. What if the potion accidentally made Steven fall in love with someone else? I didn't know how it all worked. I'd certainly seen a movie or two where that mishap occurred. "He has to want only me," I insisted. I stepped over to stand near Miss Tamtam, trying to ignore the acrid smell now rising with the steam over the boiling pot. "Of course, child," Miss Tamtam purred. "But it takes something of you to do that." She stepped to me and tilted her head forward, sniffing. The action reminded me of a wolf tracking prey in the snow. I froze in place while she bent lower, weaving her head back and forth across my torso. "You having the moon cycle. I smell it fresh on you." She looked up. Her eyes gleamed as they scanned my stunned face. That blood be the best. She abruptly stood and whirled over to a shelf above the hot plate and returned with a small coffee mug. Take this in there and put your plug in it. She pointed to the cramped bathroom across from the living room. I nodded and took the cup. My body shook as I sat on the toilet with one hand clutching the mug between my legs. I pulled the tampon string, catching the blood-soaked cotton cylinder in the cup with a wet, plunking sound, and set the mug on the back of the toilet, avoiding looking inside, and inserted a fresh tampon. Washing my hands in the stained sink, I studied my reflection in the mirror. I looked crazy. My eyes were bulging, wet globes straining from pale skin. 2 roaches twitched as they perched on the faucet. Even the roaches have someone. I laughed. But it didn't sound like my laugh. It sounded a lot like Miss Tam-Tam's horrible, empty, cold laugh. I returned to the kitchen in time to see Miss Tam-Tam sprinkling a white powder into the pot. She took the mug from my hands with a monstrous grin. The 13th is a powerful day for the spell, she said. I realized it was Friday the 13th. Perfect. More of that terrible empty laughter wriggled in my throat, and I clamped my mouth shut. Miss Tam-Tam turned and tossed the bloody contents of the mug into the boiling pot. A hiss of steam, pink in color, escaped the bubbling liquid. My stomach lurched, and I wrapped my arms protectively around my body. Miss Tam-Tam whispered in a language I never heard before as she stirred the liquid in what looked like very specific rotations. She ladled the thick-looking dark red potion into a small silver flask and turned to me. Just remember, child, he'll be with you forever. No matter what. She intoned, her face a statue. Forever, I whispered, and carefully tucked the flask into my backpack. Before she could say another word, I ran from the apartment. Her horrible laughter followed me down the stairs and into the entry hallway. Outside, the sunlight was blinding, and I gulped at the fresh air. On the bus ride home, I began to form a plan. Stephen would be at Jennifer Miller's party. I'd overheard several of the kids at school talking about Jennifer's kick-ass Friday the 13th party. Jennifer lived in a big, fancy house a few blocks from the school. All the popular kids would be there, and probably a few burnouts too. I figured I could sneak in relatively unnoticed. I was invisible, after all. I'd pour the potion into Stephen's drink the first chance I could. Then, I'd wait. My heart pounded as I imagined having him all to myself. I imagined him holding me, and my cheeks ignited. I imagined not being alone. My mom wasn't home as usual when I arrived back at the trailer. I took a long shower. I tried to wash away any lingering smell that might have contaminated me in that awful apartment. After my shower, I shifted through my mom's closet and pulled out a mini dress. It was black, and probably the least revealing outfit she owned. I pulled the stretchy fabric over my body. The dress was a bit loose and hung around my thin frame, but it would do. I took time to brush and braid my hair, and even swiped a little mascara onto my eyelashes. It was a special night, after all. It was a 2-mile walk to the school, and just a couple blocks more to Jennifer's house. I tied my sneakers. No dress shoes for me. The single pair of sneakers was all I had, and I knew I couldn't make the walk wearing my mom's ridiculous slut heels. I stuffed the potion into my jacket pocket and headed down the street. The cold winter wind whipped around my bare legs. Along the walk, I imagined Steven asking me to the prom. I imagined Steven proposing. I imagined being with Steven forever. My pace was slow as I dreamed of never being alone again. The sun had already begun to set when after I left the trailer, and it was getting dark fast. I was almost halfway to the school when thunder rumbled throughout the sky. A light mist of freezing rain fell on me, and I pulled my thin jacket around me as tightly as possible, thankful to feel the comforting weight of the flask in my pocket. A car splashed past me and jerked to a halt before reversing. I knew that car. It was a completely refurbished 1976 Dodge Charger, cherry red and sexy as hell. It was Steven's car. I had overheard him talking about it several times. He restored it with his dad. It was one of my favorite late-night fantasies to imagine Steven's body pressed against mine in the back seat of that car. I blinked in the increasing rainfall as the driver's window lowered to reveal Steven's beautiful face, smiling with concern.
"You need a ride?"
He asked. I could already smell him, and the warmth flowed through my body. I couldn't believe my luck. Yes, please," I stuttered and hurried to the passenger door. The lock clicked, and I scrambled in out of the rain. I couldn't help but grin like an idiot at him while I clicked my seatbelt. I noticed he wasn't wearing his. Such a naughty boy. So sexy. I shivered and whispered a thank you.
"No problem,"
he said, and began driving.
"Where to?"
"Oh, I was going to Jennifer's party," I answered. "I heard it was going to be cool." To my horror, he started laughing. My stomach sank as if he chuckled like someone would if a small child told a knock-knock joke.
"I don't think that's a good idea,"
he said after a minute. He eased his foot off the accelerator, and I could feel the car slowing. He had a half smile on his lips, a pitying smile. He pitied me. My blood started to boil.
"Listen, you know the kids there are just going to make fun of you. You won't have any fun around them. They can be kind of mean,"
he explained, still wearing that stupid nice guy smile. His hands turned the steering wheel, pointing the car in the other direction. He was taking me back home, back to that empty trailer with only my dead pets for company, back to being alone. The rain was pouring and flashes of lightning illuminated the empty sidewalks and manicured lawns leading to cozy houses full of happy little perfect families, just like Steven's family. He reached out to pat my shoulder and my vision flooded with red. I didn't need his fucking pity. He was supposed to love me, damn it! My hand moved on its own, shooting out to grab the back of his head and slamming his shocked face against the driver's side window with all my strength. His body tensed in surprise and his legs straightened, jamming hard on the pedal. The engine growled and the car rocketed forward, wheels spinning on the rain-slick streets. I could hear myself screaming with rage just before the car crashed into a massive oak tree. There was a wet, crunching sound when his face hit the steering wheel. No airbags in his precious Charger. Everything seemed to be in slow motion. I could see the top of the steering wheel disappear above his nose. His eyes popped like little grapes before the steering wheel pushed into his head. Blood exploded onto the dashboard and splashed across the windshield. The seatbelt tightened around my body, squeezing the air from my chest. My head snapped back and hit the seat with a thump. Dark butterflies blotted my vision. I heard the same horrible buzzing sound from Miss Tam Tam's apartment. Like 1,000 bees were inside my head. I started to sink into the dark. Lightning flashed milliseconds before a booming crack of thunder erupted in the sky. I jumped and looked out my window to see if anyone was watching. The curtains covering the windows of the surrounding houses remained shut. Few lights were on. mostly the blue haze of television sets. My brain went into overdrive, trying to figure out what to do next. The overwhelming reality of what I had just done washed over me, and my lips trembled as tears fell fat and hot on my cheeks. On impulse, I pulled the flask out of my pocket. It was magic, right? Miss Tam Tam said we would be together forever. Maybe it could fix this. I set the flask on the dashboard and pulled as hard as I could on Stephen's shoulders. After several minutes of straining, there was a squelching, sloppy noise, followed by what sounded like a champagne cork popping. Stephen's head flew back against his seat, and a fresh spray of blood decorated the ceiling. A wail surged out of my throat when I saw his face. Once beautiful green eyes were gone. Instead, there was a deep crevice where his skull had shattered and collapsed inward. There was nothing but a mass of blood and white, runny fluid. What was left of his eyes, trailing down his face into his open mouth. I cradled his face with both my hands and whimpered as I leaned forward to kiss the top of his lip. I tasted the blood and swallowed. I needed to fix him. I grabbed the flask, snapped off the top, and poured the potion into his mouth. Before it could dribble out, I pushed up on his chin to close his mouth, lifting upward to tilt his head back so the potion could slide down his throat. I held his head that way for at least a minute, waiting for even a hint of something. Any sign it was working. There was nothing. I screamed in frustration and released his chin. His body slumped to lean against me. He looked like he was sleeping. I gently kissed the top of his head before I shifted out from under his body. I opened the passenger door and backed out, careful to let Stephen's body slide all the way down onto the seat. I started running. I ran the entire way home, my chest burning. I slammed the door to the trailer shut, tore off my soaking jacket, and kicked off my wet shoes. Walking down the hallway, I peeled off the dress and finally climbed into bed. I cried myself to sleep and dreamed of Stephen looking at me with no eyes. The following day, the news reported of a high school student involved in a tragic accident. The community was shocked. The footage continued, showing stupid girls clutching each other and sobbing about how much everyone loved him. I felt so empty and more alone than I had ever felt. I crawled under the trailer and lay next to my buried pets for most of the day. Late in the evening, I finally crawled out from under the trailer and went inside. My mom still wasn't home. I tried to eat some of the stale crackers left in the kitchen, but they were sawdust in my mouth. I gave up and shuffled into the living room and turned on the TV. The news reporter gave an update about a small flask found in the car at the crime scene. Police suspected drunk driving. I closed my eyes and I could see Stephen's mouth. Bloody, still beautiful. I spent 2 hours in the living room, watching the news, afraid of hearing any witnesses seeing a woman fleeing the scene. There was no reason to suspect me, of course. No one had seen Stephen pick me up in his car. No one could ever connect us. He was loved, and I was invisible. That night, I crawled into my bed and pulled the threadbare blanket over my head. I was attempting to will myself to sleep when I heard the faintest creak near my door. Slowly, I pulled the blanket past my eyes and looked at the doorway. Someone was standing there, in the dark. Someone tall I blinked, and the figure lurched forward in a jerky motion. I scrambled to sit up as the figure moved closer. The moonlight from my window threw a small square of light in the middle of the room. The figure moved into the light, and I could see its face. It was Stephen. Beautiful, mangled Stephen, with no eyes. He was naked, and a dark, jagged Y-shaped cut was stitched closed on his torso, an autopsy scar. He stood in the light, his body swaying slightly. He looked like he was trying to hear my breathing. I whispered his name, and his head jerked to face me. His body moved quickly, scuttling in that strange, jerky motion, almost like a marionette puppet with a lunatic pulling the strings. He banged his shins on the foot of my bed, and then spider-crawled over me until his face was inches from mine. He didn't smell like body wash. He smelled very dead. He craned his neck forward until his lips rested against mine. Dry, flaking, cold lips covered mine. My first kiss. The smell of rot enveloped me, and I gagged. He shifted his body up mine and lay next to me, his arm draped across my stomach.
Forever,
he croaked. Forever, I answered, and snuggled up against him. I finally wasn't alone. I haven't slept in 3 days. I'm too afraid to. I'm so exhausted, I can barely get my mind right to form the words. It sounds insane, and I can't make it make sense. But I'll do my best to explain. It all started on December 21st of last year. You know, the day the internet claims the planets would align and a selected few would find themselves blessed with magical and mysterious powers, unlike anything anyone had ever seen. In actuality, when the planets aligned, it just made the existing energies on Earth even more potent, allowing people with an in-tune spiritual connection to the outer planes more powerful. So basically, no superpowers, but whatever manifested during that day was more likely to happen because of the sudden energy shift. I know this is hard to follow, but bear with me. I would consider myself a very spiritual being. I'm not a Christian, but I'm very religious. I would consider myself pagan. I practice witchcraft and have been for a few years now. I usually don't dabble in spellcasting because of the repercussions that follow. I believe in karma and in the idea that whatever you put out comes back times 3. It's called the rule of 3. Not all witches believe in it, but I do. And I believe it affects everyone. I knew of this rule 7 years ago when I discovered Wicca for the first time. When I met my now husband, I learned of this rule. I knew of this rule when he told me he had been sexually assaulted at his bachelor party by the dancer his friends had hired, and how disgusting he felt after the ordeal was over. I knew of this rule when I saw the video his friends had taken, and he was begging them to let him leave, and pleaded with this little bitch to not touch him anymore. I knew of this rule when she proceeded to grope his crotch, sliding her tongue across his face and rip off his shirt. I knew of this rule when he began to cry. He prayed for it all to stop as she climbed on top of him, grinding her body against his. I knew of this rule when his friends stood around, laughing at him, and the girl grabbed the back of his head, pushing his face into her chest. I knew of this rule as I made my plan to make her pay for what she did. I watched the video in horror and disgust. People love to talk about the harassment that women deal with regularly, but they never discuss the men who deal with it.
They never mention how some men are ridiculed for coming out about being victims because they are men, and they should have just enjoyed it. And even though my husband begged, pleaded, and even cried for them to stop, they just stood around, laughing, making jokes, and nitpicking. Before he told me what had happened, he had changed his mind about having his groomsmen involved. I thought it was inconvenient, but I didn't question it. It was just me, my bridesmaids, and him. And after he told me about what had happened, I was enraged. Not at him, not even at his friends, but at that woman, if you can even call her that. To allow this man to feel used and disgraced after he made it clear he wanted nothing more to do with her. And for what? Some money? In addition to his groomsmen's party, I took down the dancer's name they were with that night. I wrote their names down in a particular book of mine and waited for the night to come. I had heard about this day and figured there'd be no better time than this to go through with my plan. In retrospect, I should have given myself more time to practice spellcasting. I didn't know anything about it. All I knew was how to protect myself from unwanted spirits in case of any emergency, which I did, but it wasn't the spirits I needed protection from. The spell was simple enough. I wanted a way to hurt them without having to physically be around them. I set it up for them to have nightmares every night for the rest of their lives. Horrible, realistic nightmares that they'd never be able to forget. And just when they think they've finally woken up, they'd find themselves sleeping. It seemed deserving enough after what they did to my husband, his friends he trusted, and a woman in an industry where she should have known better. And I like to think that it worked. At least that's what I'm telling myself. But as the spell settled, I noticed a change in my dreams as well. Usually I can tell that I'm dreaming by looking up at the sky. If I see 2 moons or a cluster of planets so close I can make them out in detail, usually seeing one of these 2 things will immediately put me at ease because I know I'm dreaming. But my dreams started changing. They became less and less obscure. Most dreams are odd in a sense. The scenery doesn't make sense, the surroundings are wrong, and objects are moving that shouldn't move. Newborn babies are talking in complex, complete sentences, but not these dreams. They felt real, like I wasn't even asleep. And it was terrifying. It lasted for weeks, until finally I broke my spell on these monstrous individuals, and I hoped that would have been the end of it. And for a while, it did get better. But then I fell asleep one night, and I was at my childhood home, and everything seemed so normal. I was with my father and mother, and they were together and happy. That should have been my first red flag. My parents had been separated since I was about 5 years old, and even now, as I approach 26, they still have their disagreements so significant that they can barely stay in the same room with each other. But what made me worry was how comfortable I was in the environment. And then my body shook, my head throbbed, and I found myself waking up in my current bedroom, my husband sleeping peacefully next to me. It was a typical dream, but what fucked me up was how real it all felt. I thought nothing of this and tossed it aside as just a very vivid dream, but then they began to become more frequent. I would have dreams of swimming in pools or lakes and wake up drenched in sweat so thick that one could argue I had water poured on me. I would have dreams of lying in my childhood bedroom and waking up so confused about how I ended up in my current home with my husband by my side. I would dream of traveling in a car for hours with strangers and woke up to find myself looking for them. Calling them by name as confusion reigned over me. It got progressively worse. so much so that I began to suspect that I wasn't even dreaming anymore. I felt as if I was tapping into a different world, a playing field that has yet to be explored, and it felt more and more real every night. As embarrassing as it is to admit, it got so bad one night. I dreamt I was in the bathroom talking to my mom and my niece, and I was sitting on the toilet and began to relieve myself. As the warm yellow fluid rushed out of me, I felt my thighs getting soaked. Suddenly, I was thrust out of my sleep and found myself covered in warm urine. My husband stirred from his sleep to see me panicking and scrubbing the mattress, ripping off the sheets and pulling the blankets off of him. Even though he doesn't look down on me for wetting the bed in my sleep, I was terribly embarrassed by the act. It shook me to the core. How real had this alternate world felt that I was honestly under the impression that I was just using the bathroom? After that night, my dreams have been more and more intense and realistic. Now it's to the point where I don't feel like I ever wake up when I sleep, and this terrifies me. What if I'd go to sleep and never wake up? What if I find myself teleporting to one of these strange parallel universes and stay there forever? What if I get stuck there, begging and pleading to wake up but can't? My life in these other worlds may not be as bad as my current life, but one thing I know about parallel universes is you're not supposed to interfere with the development of the world you enter. It could very much destroy the foundation of the world in question, and you can unintentionally unravel the natural balance of the universe in itself. We exist in our planes for a reason, and even if I try to explain this to someone else in the other universe, they probably wouldn't believe me anyway. 3 nights ago, I had one of the worst dreams ever. My husband and I have been having minor disagreements lately, and we've been dealing with them as best we could. Due to my high-functioning depression and even higher levels of paranoia and anxiety, needless to say, our love life has reached a wall. It's been challenging to participate in the act of lovemaking when I feel like my world is literally falling apart. And even though my husband is understanding and empathetic, he's also terribly sexually frustrated, which then adds to my anxiety by wafting me in a wave of guilt. I've buried myself in anxiety and overthinking, fearing the worst, but this dream killed me. We were together in our marital bed, and I recognized the room so vividly. It was our bedroom. The shelf with my trinkets and knickknacks were placed in their exact spots, the dark purple curtains blocking out the light from outside. The TV playing our usual bedtime show was off. The lights we used to color the room were dark, but they were all in their very spots. As my husband and I began to converse, he decided right then and there that he was done with me and wanted to leave. I could hear his voice so clearly. "I'm so done with this shit. I'm so sick of this shit. I'm done. I'm leaving." My eyes began to fill with tears. My throat closed as I struggled not to let out a cough. My mouth dried up and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I tried pleading with him, bargaining even, giving into my desperation and willing to do anything to keep him from leaving. I finally got my eyes opened enough to see his face. And sure enough, it was his face. His low eyes, a blank expression and a motionless glare. He was done with me, just as he said, and I knew there was nothing I could say to make him change his mind. I forced myself to wake up. I prayed that it was all a dream, and I did everything in my power to stir from my sleep, but all my efforts meant nothing. He was done with me. It was over. He had given up on me, and my heart was broken. I didn't even have words left to deliver. No more air to choke out, no more tears to cry. I was just broken. I couldn't slow my breathing, And eventually, I just stopped trying. I felt myself suffocating under my heartache, and I allowed myself to slip into unconsciousness. And finally, I woke up. The room looked the same as it had, but my husband was still sleeping, breathing softly, his warm body pressed against my back. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to risk the chance of me still being asleep. I waited for several minutes until I finally decided to move, and when I did, I began to cry. My husband began to stir, asking me what was wrong, but I couldn't speak. I just grabbed him, pulling him into me and cradling his back. I kissed his shoulders and began to rock back and forth. After a few more minutes, I told him about my dream, and he embraced me, reassuring me that it was only a dream and that he wasn't going anywhere. This made me feel better, but I was so afraid to even close my eyes. That was 3 nights ago, and I haven't shut my eyes since. I'm so afraid to go back to sleep. It's not even sleep paralysis where your body is stuck, or a regular nightmare where a family member dies, or you're on the verge of death, or inanimate objects come to life. It's worse than that. It's another world I'm being sent to by outside forces. It's a world where everything is outside of my control, and no matter what I do, I can't grasp it. I can't change it. I can't do anything to make it go away. I don't ever want to go back there. I'd rather die first. And I know you won't believe me, and I know how crazy this all sounds, but that's where I'm at. I don't know how much longer I can force myself to stay away. Every time I blink, I fear my eyes will remain closed. As if the hallucinations weren't my only problem. It's almost as if the parallels are trying to feed into this universe, changing the world around to fit their molds and force me back. I guess it makes sense that last night when I stepped outside and looked up, I saw 2 moons in the sky.
Dusk had only just settled over the vacant crop fields of Goochland County, a vast rural farming area just west of Richmond, Virginia. The sky was bruised in shades of burnt orange near the horizon that bled into deep reds, purples, and blacks as the sun continued to sink with each passing moment. On any other night, this would have been the start of an ideal summer evening for this normally serene area. Unfortunately, Special Agent Lowell knew this would be no ordinary evening as he and his partner raced down Route 6 toward their latest assignment. Tell me, how can it be this goddamn hot with the sun almost all the way down? Groaned Evans, Lowell's partner for the past 5 years. I mean, you're not even that far south. Lowell chuckled as Evans dabbed the sweat from his forehead with his necktie and adjusted the AC vent to blow directly in his face. So what's the word? Heard you were supposed to fill me in on the way to the scene. Lowell peered out the driver's side window with his steel blue eyes and watched the long shadows of the neighboring forest smear across the painted sky. A couple of kids were out here in the countryside firing a potato gun at the windows of an abandoned barn just off the main stretch here. One of the kids decided to look through the broken windows and found it to be not so abandoned after all. Local PD was called in, but they phoned us. They think it might be another one. They said they preserved the scene and haven't touched anything. The local contact, someone named Danvers, I think, said he wants us to look over the scene with his CS team. We'll know more once we get there. Potato gun? Evans mused aloud. The hell was a potato gun? Lowell chuckled again. Some cobbled-together PVC pipes, a potato, some hairspray, and an igniter. Heard these things can launch a potato over 100 yards. Could you use other vegetables, like a carrot or an onion? How the hell should I know? Look, we're almost here. I'm gonna need you to talk to the officers that responded to the boys' call. Find out what you can from them and see if any of the boys want to give a statement about what happened. I'll talk to our contact about the situation and anything suspicious that may have happened recently in the area. Then we'll both examine the scene together. Evans nodded that he understood the protocol, then turned his attention to his phone messages. And Evans, Lowell continued, keep the potato gun questions to a minimum, please. Night had finally settled in as the two special agents pulled up to the crime scene. Gone now were the painted skies and endless fields of shadows. Only the hypnotic swirling of red and blue police lights, pierced by long spotlight beams, illuminated the small wooded area, projecting dancing shadows onto the surrounding trees and decrepit barn. As the two agents got out of their vehicle, a local detective hastily approached them from behind the yellow police tape. Special Agent Lowell, Special Agent Evans, thank you for coming out here on such short notice. We've got a real mess back there, and, well, I suppose you men would like to have a look for yourselves. Special Agent Lowell gave the young detective a once-over before turning to his partner. Evans, go get statements from the other officers and CSI on the scene, and find out if any of the boys is willing to talk with us tomorrow morning. I'll go with Detective Danvers here and inspect the victim and the barn. Join us when you're ready and bring the CS lead with you. Evans nodded, retrieved his notepad and pen from his pocket, and proceeded toward the other officers and crime scene personnel standing outside of the yellow-taped perimeter. Lowell gestured to Detective Danvers to lead the way. Sir, Detective Danvers began as they crossed under the police tape and made their way towards the barn. It's an honor to get to work with you and your partner. When we heard the FBI was sending agents to our podunk little county, we never imagined it'd be you and Agent Evans. Agent Lowell gave a brief smile and nodded to show his appreciation. He'd never considered himself and Evans as big names at the FBI, but this latest series of murders and their grotesque tableaus made them household names and regular discussion topics at dinner tables across the Mid-Atlantic region. Even with no major leads or arrests made in regards to what the news organizations were now calling the Virginia Vampire. Detective Danvers cleared his throat and turned to Special Agent Lowell. Sir, quick question. How did you know my name? I know I was a bit flustered when you arrived, but I don't remember introducing myself. Special Agent Lowell paused at the entrance to the weather-worn barn. Well, I was told I'd be assisted by a Detective Danvers. You matched the description I was given. You were the first person to approach us upon our arrival at the scene. And, well, it's on your nameplate. Lowell tapped the detective's name tag with his pen, and the two men shared a brief chuckle before remembering the grotesque horrors that awaited just beyond the decrepit wooden door that separated them from a waking nightmare. The barn's interior expressed the same stages of decrepitness and disuse as the exteriors had suggested. Broken farm equipment and tools, rusted field implements, decomposing planks and cobwebs adorned every wall and surface not otherwise occupied by the crime scene, which stood in the glow of the floodlights like a true-to-life Halloween display. The stench of the place was just as offensive as the sight of it. The mustiness and mildew odors, coupled with the retch-inducing smell of decay and carnage, left to bake in the Virginia heat, was enough to make even the seasoned agent cover his nose and turn his head as the initial wave hit him. The grisly tableau before them stood in horrific beauty, like a scene pulled straight from a kabuki play. The victim's remains were positioned as though she were running and in mid-stride. Galvanized wiring and steel rods held her lifeless body erect. Below her waist, where her legs had once been, were two antique rakes, crudely inserted into the ragged stumps. Agent Lowell sighed and shook his head. This was, undoubtedly, the work of him. So, what do we got? Evans asked, entering the barn with a look of disgust in his face. Lowell pulled out a pair of latex gloves and slid them into his hands. He turned to his partner. He was about to have a closer look now, but from a preliminary check over, I think it's him. Evans shook his head in disappointment. Him? You mean the vampire, don't you? Detective Danvers asked as a tone of dread grew in his voice. The agents nodded almost simultaneously, then proceeded to collect evidence from the killer's latest victim. Perfection. There was no other word to describe them. Even the jagged saw marks that graced the severed appendages, like a row of shark's teeth, could not distract from the abject beauty of these trophies. It had taken Dalton Grigsby months to find her, then weeks to memorize her jogging schedule and routes, but he finally had them. The most perfect pair of legs. He parked his van in the little concrete driveway that ran alongside the house he and his late wife had purchased shortly after their wedding. The house stood at the end of a rural dead-end road that backed up to a heavily wooded area. The nearest neighbor had a small farm that was closer to the main road, about 2 miles away. Dalton didn't mind. He required seclusion for this endeavor. The once quaint brick rancher now slouched in various stages of decay and neglect. From the cracks running through the bricks and foundation to the weather-worn roof with patches of moss and missing shingles, this once promising home now stood as a reflection of its sole occupant's mental state. Broken, rotted, neglected. He made his way through the worm-eaten front door and proceeded down into the only room of the house he appreciated anymore, the cellar. There, in the cool, subterranean dungeon, Dalton had begun what he considered his life's most important work. For well over a year, he'd studied, hunted, subdued, and mutilated 5 people to complete this masterpiece. But it was more than just art to him. These components, these objects of flesh and bone, would soon be elevated into something so beautiful, so magnificent, that to behold it would make even the most steadfast person drop to their knees and weep. He created the bloody appendages in his arms like one would a cooing infant, then placed them gently onto his workbench. Dalton reached out with his blood-drenched hands and caressed the 2 perfect limbs. He knew he would cherish this moment, just as he had cherished the others that came before it. He groped around under his workstation and retrieved the tools and equipment he required to continue what he now considered his life's only true purpose. These implements he used were nothing fancy. Some galvanized metal wire, rebar, heavy-gauge needles, and a suture kit. Once everything was ready and in place, he walked the 6 short steps from the bench to the display rack where his incomplete masterpiece waited, draped in a cloth. With a quick jerk, Dalton ceremoniously removed the covering and tossed it to the ground. He gazed at the magnificence that hung before him as tears welled up in his eyes. He extended a trembling hand toward his beautiful creation, while his lips quivered uncontrollably. "Soon," he whispered longingly. "Soon you will be complete, my darling. Only a few more pieces left." His voice trailed off, his determination and purpose reignited in him. It was time to add those glorious legs to his beloved creation, but first, he must consult the book. Thin trails of smoke danced carelessly from the end of Agent Lowell's cigarette as he pored over his notes and papers from the previous crime scenes. The dim orange glow from the nightstand's lamp washed over the room, casting vague shadows in the walls from the outdated furniture. While he'd grown accustomed to staying in meager accommodations, while on assignment. His current dwelling gave the impression it had not been renovated since the mid-70s. Thankfully, he didn't have to stare at too much of the decor. The better part of the dated bedspread was covered in a sea of witness statements and crime scene photos. Lowell let out a deep sigh, expelling the smoke from his lungs. All of the evidence left at the scene fit the vampire's MO, but they were no closer to identifying him, let alone bringing him in. He hated to admit this, but his killer was good at what he did. He knew exactly what to leave to entice the agents, and simultaneously, what to take with him to avoid capture. He abducted his victims in one county or city, killed and dismembered them somewhere private, then staged them in an entirely separate location. Whatever tools and implements he used, he brought with him, save for the props he would improvise onto, and sometimes into the victim's corpse. He left no prints or hair. The only fluids at the scenes belonged to the victims. He hunted and killed people of different races, ages, and genders. Even his choice of trophies changed from killing to killing. The first victim, a 22-year-old white female swimming instructor named Melissa Jarvis, had what could only be described as her torso removed. Everything from her neck down to her pelvis was taken. Victim 2, a 43-year-old black male named Jeffrey Shepard, known in the music scene as Big Papa Crown, had his skull, ears, and tongue removed. All other aspects of his head, body, and face were present at the scene. 18-year-old Anna Lau, an Asian-American girl, voted prom queen at Heritage High School, had her face and scalp removed. The fourth victim, a 34-year-old bodybuilder named Hassim Jabal, had both arms removed at the shoulders. Last, but certainly not least, the latest victim, identified as 29-year-old Amanda Westphal, had both of her legs removed. Why these parts? Lowell muttered to himself. What are you doing with them? This question had stumbled aimlessly around his mind since the first victim's remains were discovered. Why was he so discerning about what parts he kept from what victims? How was he choosing them? What was his endgame? Lowell needed to call it a night. He'd been at this for hours since they'd returned from the scene, and he knew they would need to get an early start, questioning the locals and running down leads in the morning. He carefully collected his files and placed them on the armchair next to his bed. With any luck, sleep would find him quickly and he could get some rest before the alarm went off in 4 hours. Just as his head graced the nearly flat motel pillow, an abrupt knock echoed from the adjoining door that led to his partner's room. "Hello, you still up?" Evans asked as he tried the knob before getting a response. Agent Lowell let out a deep sigh, threw off his covers, put on his robe, and unlocked the door for him. "Sorry you weren't sleeping, were you? I saw the light under the door and figured I'd see if you were still going over the case." Lowell shook his head and gestured for him to have a seat. Evans moved the papers and files off the chair and placed them on the floor. From the looks of it, he was having a long night as well. "Trouble sleeping, Evans?" Lowell asked as he offered his sweat-soaked partner a drink, which he graciously accepted. "It's just so damn hot," Evans replied, pressing the cool glass of scotch against his forehead. "Isn't it supposed to get cooler when the sun goes down?" Lowell chuckled and took a sip of his drink. If Virginia was a desert, sure, but the humidity here traps the heat in. Lowell set his glass down on the nightstand that collected the papers from the floor, returning them to the bed where he had just finished going over them. "Well, I don't suppose you came by to bitch about the hate. What's in your mind?" "Look, based on what we saw today, there's no doubt it's him. But I feel like we're still no closer to catching him than we were when the last victim was found. If he's eating them, he's leaving a lot of stuff behind. If he's disposing of the parts elsewhere, he's doing a damn good job of keeping those locations a secret. If he's keeping them, then we still don't have a motive other than derangement. It appeared the two men were struggling with the same blocks in the case. Lowell had hoped Evans would have found something he didn't, or noticed something that had eluded them from earlier that day. But sadly, this was not the case. The two agents compared notes until the first signs of dawn emblazoned the shades on Lowell's window, and the alarm he had set began to screech from his cell phone. With no sleep to be had for either of them, Lowell and Evans got dressed, drank some coffee, and headed out to the parking lot where their rental was waiting. "You know," Lowell began, "I thought of something. All of the victims we found were good, if not great, at something. All of them had talents or outstanding features. Swimming, rapping, weightlifting, physical beauty. They all had body parts taken relating to their gifts. Going off what was taken from the latest victim, I bet you she was a runner. So, you think he's collecting the best parts of the people he murders?" Evans responded. "How does that help us prevent the next one? What parts do you think he's after next?" "I don't know, but I feel like his hunting ground is a lot smaller than we originally thought. They may not live near each other, but maybe they share a common link." Lowell pulled out his cell phone and called into the field office. "Washburn. Yeah, it's Lowell. Listen, pull up the files on the vampire's victims. I need you to check credit and debit card statements, phone records, and social media. Find out if any of them frequent any of the same places in the last few months leading up to the murders." He hung up the phone and shot Evans a smile. "Come on. This may be the break we needed." "So, what exactly are we looking for?" Evans asked as he, Lowell, and Washburn rigorously pored over bank statements and social media posts belonging to the victims. "Any thoughts on what you think links them?" Agent Lowell let out a deep sigh. "No, but you had to have seen them all somewhere. While they weren't all from the Richmond area, they were all residents of Virginia. I think he's using out-of-the-way locations to dispose of the remains to give the impression he travels far to find them. But I bet good money he found them all within a 30-minute drive of where he first saw them. They're all in different age groups. They're different races. He's not picky about gender, but something connects them." Agent Washburn removed his wireframe bifocals and gave his temples a firm, then therapeutic rub. He'd been in the FBI for over 20 years and had worked on everything from sequence killings to human trafficking. While his days in the field were far behind him, he still had the insight and intuition to help on serious cases, like the Virginia vampire. Unfortunately, this was no ordinary case, and the gruesomeness of these killings were more vile and grotesque than the cases that had crossed his desk since he was reassigned to a desk job. This assignment was not by choice. While working in conjunction with local SWAT and narcotics units in Detroit, Washburn had caught a stray bullet. Though his injury wasn't fatal, the 9mm round had shattered his right knee. James Brisson, director of the FBI at the time, told him he couldn't remain in the field, though Washburn insisted he could still function out on assignments. Brisson gave him an ultimatum: desk or retirement. Washburn begrudgingly took the desk job, knowing he could still be of value to the Bureau. "So we don't think this one is eating them. Remember that case back in 2005? We didn't think that guy was eating them either, because of what he took and what he left. but he turned out to be a cannibal. Washburn mused as he monotonously clicked through the social media posts of the deceased. He'd been at it for hours now. Everything from photos to tweets to check-ins to memes. His eyes were beginning to burn and his brain felt fuzzy. He needed a break. I'm going to head down to the commissary and get some good coffee. Either of you want anything? Evans shook his head and continued to scan through bank statements and receipts. Lowell gave no response. He seemed transfixed on something. Evans and Washburn knew he'd found something. Washburn, go back to those photos of Big Papa Crown's album launch party. Evans pulled up the monthly statements of Melissa Jarvis. Check specifically for automatic withdrawals like donations or memberships. A look of righteous determination spread across Lowell's face, invigorating his colleagues. He was good like that. They knew once he was onto something, they would find a new lead in the case. Here, Washburn called from his desk. Shepard's album launch party. Looks like they held most of the shindig in the modern art section of VMFA. Lowell turned the screen to get a better look. It was undoubtedly the Virginia Museum of Fine Art. He made it a point to visit when they first arrived in the Richmond area. Why the museum? I took a listen to some of Shepard's music. Doesn't seem like the artsy type to me. You'd be surprised, Washburn. Lowell responded without looking up from the screen. Look here. Lowell continued while pointing at the photos. This painting is in almost every photo. Turns out it was painted by the same artist that did his latest album cover art. Evans nodded in agreement as he quickly opened a document on his own computer. Look here, Evans shouted excitedly. We may have hit it, Lowell. Melissa Jarvis was a frequent donator and visitor to the VMFA. Her bank statements showed monthly donations. As the day went on, more and more connections to the museum revealed themselves. Anna Lau took her senior photos in the museum's sculpture garden. Asim Jabal worked in the shipping and receiving department of the museum, using his impressive physique to move the heavier shipments the others couldn't. Finally, there was Amanda Westfall, the runner. She attended a VMFA banquet to honor the winners of the Monument Avenue 10K. Washburn, give the VMFA a call. Let them know Evans and I are on the way. Then get in touch with local PD from Richmond, Enrico, and Goochland, and fill them in on what we know. Evans, grab your stuff. Evans quickly gathered his things and followed Lowell out to the car. You think our guy is another museum regular? Evans asked as they hurried through the parking lot. Lowell handed his partner a series of printouts from their computer searches. Notice anything, Evans? Lowell asked as he lit his first cigarette since the one he smoked last night. See this guy with the camera snapping shots of Shepard from the crowd? Same guy with his phone out in the background of Anna's senior photos. Same guy taking a selfie with Amanda at the banquet. In all of these photos, he's wearing a museum ID badge. He made sure to keep his name out of full view in all of the photos, but you can just make out the museum name and insignia. He works there, Evans. Come on, get in the car. It was nearly closing time as Agents Lowell and Evans arrived at the museum. The sound of high school field trips and young children enjoying the youth art programs had faded to the light murmurs and echoing footsteps of the more mature patrons seeking to view the antiquities and masterpieces after a long day of work in peace. Evans couldn't help but admire some of the exhibits they passed as they walked toward the information desk. He was never one for museums as a child, but was slowly coming around to them. I wish we had time to look around, Evans whispered to his partner as they approached the desk. Some of this stuff is really fantastic. Lowell sighed and shook his head. You should have come with me when we first got to town. The place is really something. Evans was prepared to retort, but was interrupted. Sorry if I kept you gentlemen waiting. I'm Jeffrey Zielinski, head curator. Any trouble finding us? Zielinski was a slight, bespectacled man. His light reddish-brown hair grayed near the temples and tapered down into a white, short-cropped beard. Agent Lowell shook his hand and introduced himself and his partner. No, not at all. I actually visited your lovely museum a few weeks ago when we got into town. Mr. Zielinski smiled. He'd been a lover of art since he was just a little boy and always enjoyed hearing praise heaped on the museum. With introductions and pleasantries out of the way, the three men strode through the library and into the curator's private office. So, gentlemen, what can we at the VMFA assist you with? I spoke with an agent Washburn, I believe, yet he gave no indication of what matter of import we'd be discussing. Should I have them close the museum early? Mr. Zielinski was clearly rattled by the FBI needing to speak with him. Not that he had done anything wrong or had anything to hide. He feared this visit would shed unfavorable light on the museum. He'd read the local papers and knew why the two agents were in town, but he refused to believe his museum had anything to do with it. Relax, Mr. Zielinski, Lowell said in a calming tone. There's no need to make your patrons leave. Agent Evans and I just have a couple questions and some photos we'd like for you to look at. After that, we should be on our way. The old curator gave an anxious nod, cleared his throat, and gestured to inform the agents he was ready to proceed. Now, Mr. Zielinski, how long have you been here at the VMFA? The curator took a sip of water from the glass on his desk, then let out a steadying sigh. Well, I started here right out of college as a docent while I studied to become a curator. That was about 32 years ago. I've been head curator here the last 20 years, he added with a small hint of pride in his voice. Agents Lowell and Evans made quick notes in their notebooks before proceeding. In that time, did you ever notice anyone acting strangely? Staff, patrons, visitors? The curator shook his head. Agent Evans reached into his briefcase and produced several photos. He carefully placed them on the desk facing Mr. Zielinski. What about this guy? Agent Evans asked, pointing to the man in the selfie with Amanda. Anything noteworthy or peculiar about him? The curator examined the photo more closely, adjusting his glasses on his nose as he did. He shook his head regretfully. No, that's just Dalton Grigsby, Mr. Zielinski began. Good worker. Started out in the shipping and receiving department. Big guy like him helped unload some of the heavier pieces the other workers couldn't handle. Him and Hasim. The two agents looked at each other, then back to Zielinski. Would that be Hasim Jabab? Agent Lowell queried as he frantically jotted down what the curator had said. Mr. Zielinski nodded nervously. Yes, he stammered. He did volunteer work here in the shipping and receiving department. There's nothing on the books about him, but I remember him. He was also really strong, bigger than Grigsby even. He stopped coming a few months back. I just figured he was finished with his volunteering. Oh, God. He was one of the victims, wasn't he? Agent Lowell gave a solemn nod as he saw tears forming in the old man's eyes. The names of the victims had been kept out of the papers, as well as some of the more gruesome details of their deaths. You said Grigsby started out in shipping and receiving. Agent Lowell started again after the curator regained his composure. What does he do now? Mr. Zielinski steadied his nerves and removed the pocket square from his jacket to dab away the tears that had streamed down his cheek at the thought of Hasim's demise. Zielinski began after clearing his throat. He works as an exhibit designer now. He has a great eye for detail, and the old curator paused. His eyes darted back and forth between the two agents. You don't think Grigsby had anything to do with this, do you? Agents Lowell and Evans exchanged an uncomfortable glance at one another. Agent Evans straightened his tie and leaned forward in his chair. "Look, this Grigsby guy is in all the photos," and before he could finish, Lowell interjected. "We would just like to talk to him, see if he knew anything about Hassim or any of the other victims. You wouldn't happen to have an address for him, would you?" The old curator nodded quickly and began to leaf through the Rolodex on the desk. With a look of solemn hesitation, he slowly removed one of the address cards and handed it slowly to Agent Lowell. "Thank you very much, Mr. Zielinski, for your cooperation and hospitality. You have a lovely museum here, and I look forward to visiting again, under happier circumstances." Mr. Zielinski gave a weak smile and stood to escort the two agents back through the lobby. As the three men crossed the now entirely deserted museum entryway, a thought came to Agent Lowell. "Mr. Zielinski, do you mind showing us what Dalton Grigsby had been working on most recently?" The curator, not wanting to refuse the requests of the FBI, led the two agents into the special exhibits wing on the second floor. Outside the roped-off archway leading into the exhibition hall was a large banner that read, "Art, Science, and the Occult. Paganism's Impact Throughout the Years." The darkened rooms and corridors of the vast marble hall echoed with the footsteps as they entered. Statues of pagan deities, various crumbling books and tomes written in dead and forgotten languages, and paintings of witch sabbaths and occult rituals all sat on display in dimly lit cases or atop pedestals. Agent Evans tried his best not to look at some of the more grotesque pieces as the three of them made their way toward the exhibit Dalton Grigsby had been assigned to work on. Unfortunately, as they rounded a sharp corner toward a dimly lit passage, a particularly disturbing painting sat in wait. From a distance, it appeared to be the depiction of a large gathering around a bonfire. However, as the trio drew closer, the ghastly details became easier to discern for Agent Evans. The bonfire was a large pile of nude, mutilated corpses that had been set ablaze. Men, women, and even small children were present in the heap of decay and desolation. The attendees of the gathering were far more horrific than they had originally seemed as well. Various beings and creatures stood with arms raised above the great death pyre. Beings with disproportionate-sized limbs and appendages that bent and twisted in undesirable ways. Beings with faces that gave only the vaguest impressions of humanity. Beings covered in blood and gore of those deemed worthy of the pile. However, the worst of those atrocities stood triumphantly atop a small hill adorned with a crudely hewn stone pulpit near its center. If scale were taken into account, this muscle-bound Goliath would have been nearly 10 feet tall. Much like the others in the cobble, this horror stood upright like a man, but its naked form was covered in reptilian-like scales and thick, dark fur. Its face was split from forehead to chin, with a vertical maw lined with teeth and protruding pieces of bone. With one clawed hand, it held a torch, the apparent catalyst of the great fire. With the other, it pointed menacingly outward at those that dared view this scene. Below the painting was a small beige information plaque that read, "The Great Reclamation, circa 1100 to 1200 AD. Tempera paint on animal hide. Artist unknown." Agent Evans was the first to turn away from the painting. The horrifying vista, coupled with the vampire case, had entwined a knot in his stomach and put ideas in his head that he did not dare put into words. Agent Lowell and Mr. Zielinski studied the painting silently for a moment. Lowell pondered what medieval mind could have imagined such a scene, while the curator stared at the painting in a mix of disgust and awe. Zelensky shook his head and gestured to a small area just across from the macabre scene. The partially completed display consisted of several marble pedestals and glass display cases, some already adorned with sculptures and artifacts dating back to the Roman occupation of Jerusalem. At the very center of the display sat an ancient tome bound in a thick, dark leather of unknown origin. A look of confusion spread across Mr. Zelensky's face. No, this isn't right," he said in a trembling voice, barely above a whisper. Agent Lowell placed a reassuring hand on the curator's shoulder before speaking up. "Is everything all right, Mr. Zelensky? Is there something wrong with the display?" The curator nodded, and with a shaking hand, pointed to the leather-bound book that seemed to be the focal point of the exhibit. "This is not the right book. This is the Liber Annorarum. The book that is supposed to be here is the Liber Sacraritas." Agent Evans gave his partner a concerned look before chiming in. "Is there any way this is a simple mistake, and Grigsby grabbed the wrong book by mistake?" Again, the curator shook his head. "No. Dalton has seen both books before. He even did the exhibit this book belongs in." Agents Lowell and Evans jotted down the names of the books, and the three men quickly made their way back to the main lobby. "Thank you very much for your time and cooperation, Mr. Zelensky. We're going to swing by Grigsby's house and question him about the missing book and what he knows about Hassim and the others." The old curator swallowed hard. "Agent Lowell," he began, you don't think he really committed those murders, do you? We just need to ask him some questions. Nothing is concrete yet, and as soon as we rule him out, the better." With that, the two agents sped off in the night toward the home of Dalton Grigsby. It was just after midnight when the two agents parked their car across the street from Grigsby's house. The road was nearly vacant, save for one or two bats that flapped their wings and screeched in the jet-black night, hunting for prey. Agents Lowell and Evans strode carefully through the overgrown crabgrass and weeds that comprised the majority of the front yard before reaching the front stoop. Without hesitation, Agent Lowell gave 3 quick pounds on the aged door. The echo from his knocks was the only response to greet them. Apart from the van parked in the driveway, the house seemed completely deserted. After waiting for almost a minute, Agent Lowell repeated his knocks. It wasn't long before the sound of footsteps could be heard moving through the decrepit domicile, growing louder as they neared the front door. With a loud click, the porch light illuminated, casting the agents in an unnatural ochre glow. "Hello?" A low, tired voice called out from the other side of the door. "Who is it?" Agent Lowell cleared his throat. "Good evening, Mr. Grigsby. We're sorry to disturb you at such a late hour. I'm Special Agent Lowell, and this is my partner, Special Agent Evans. We'd like to speak with you about the museum you work for. It appears something's gone missing." Only silence answered them for what felt like an eternity before the door slowly creaked open. Before them stood a man in his late 30s. He was average height, but even the loose-fitting jeans and black t-shirt he'd thrown on to answer the door could not hide the muscles that must have taken him years of training to pack on. Dalton pushed his long black hair out of his face and rubbed the last traces of sleep from his eyes. "Would you gentlemen like to come in? I can put some coffee on if you like." The agents accepted the invitation and followed him through the front sitting room and into the kitchen. Much like the rest of the house, the kitchen was in dire need of renovation. The paint chipped and cracked in various places, revealing the color the walls had originally worn. The wallpaper was torn and peeled away in places, as if someone once had the idea to change it, but gave up. All of the appliances were outdated and could do with some cleaning. Oil and grease stains covered the stove's flat top and the surrounding counters. Dalton started the coffee maker, then took a seat across from the two agents at a small round dinette table in the center of the kitchen. Mr. Grigsby, Agent Lowell began, while pulling out several folders from his briefcase, were you aware that one of the artifacts from your exhibit had gone missing? Dalton gave out a deep sigh and solemnly shook his head. No, he lied while looking at Agent Lowell in the eyes. Last I checked, everything was where it should be. Do you mind telling me what's gone missing? Agent Evans took out his notepad and tried his best to pronounce the name of the stolen book. The Liber Sacri Redis? Mr. Zelensky said another book had been put in its place. A book belonging to another exhibit you'd worked on not long before this one. A look of annoyance spread across Grigsby's face. You think I stole it, don't you? His voice was flat and nearly robotic in its delivery. What can you tell us about Asim Jabal? Mr. Zelensky said you and he worked together briefly. He hasn't been at work for a long time. Do you think he had anything to do with the missing book? A sardonic smile spread across Dalton's face. Asim? Whispered Grigsby with a sense of longing in his voice. I remember Asim. He had the most amazing physique. I once thought about asking him to train me at the gym, but I was too shy. I mean, did you see the arms on this guy? Evans shot Lowell a worried glance. A high-pitched beeping noise began to sound off from the coffee maker on the counter behind Grigsby, but he ignored it, his eyes fixed on the photos in front of him. Agent Evans slowly reached for the gun in his holster so as not to draw attention from the reminiscing man across the table. Don't bother, Grigsby said calmly, without even turning his attention to Evans. In those next moments, several things happened in rapid succession. Both agents drew their sidearms. Grigsby flipped the table toward them, shut off the kitchen light, and darted toward the door that led into his cellar. Evans! Agent Lowell shouted through the darkness, gun still drawn and at the ready. Do you have eyes on Grigsby? Agent Lowell groped the walls until his fingers found the light switch. With the lights back on, the two agents scanned the room for the missing suspect. I heard a door open near the living room. I think he ran into the cellar. Evans replied as sweat began to drip down his forehead. Adrenaline coursed through his body as the thought finally came to him. We found him. Okay, Evans, listen. Agent Lowell whispered to his partner. Go secure the living room and front door while I call this in so we can get some backup out here. The agent's words were suddenly cut short by several blasts from a shotgun that penetrated through the floor beneath them. Agent Evans returned fire blindly into the deteriorating floorboards, hoping to end this situation as quickly as possible. After exchanging several volleys, the gunfire from the cellar finally ceased. There was the sound of a shotgun clattering to the ground and the thud of a body slumping onto the floor. Agent Lowell let out a deep sigh. He and his partner were not hit by any of the Grigsby shots. He caught his breath and turned to Evans. Okay, let's call it in and sweep the house. I think whatever he was doing with his trophies, he was doing here. It's quiet, isolated, and unassuming. Agent Lowell reached for his radio to call in for backup. His hand had barely grasped the receiver when a loud bang erupted from the cellar just beneath his feet. Buckshot and wooden shrapnel pierced through the bottom of his feet and calves. With that final assault, the floor gave way and crashed into the cellar below. Agent Lowell hit hard on the dusty concrete floor below, with his partner landing close by. Grigsby was nowhere to be seen. Lowell, Evans shouted. Did he get you? Are you okay? Agent Lowell gave no response. Blood loss from the ragged flesh that once composed the lower portions of his legs, and the sudden fall through the floor, had stunned the veteran agent. Oh my God! Lowell, I'm going to call for help. We're going to get out of here. Evans fumbled for his radio when the sound of a cocking shotgun behind him shattered the silence. "I wouldn't if I were you," Grigsby threatened in a controlled tone. "Don't worry, Agent Evans. You have the great privilege of witnessing what comes next. Unfortunately, until my work here is complete, I must devote my undivided attention to the tasks at hand." With that, Grigsby slammed the butt of the shotgun into the back of Agent Evans' head. Evans felt the room spin, then his vision blurred, then it went dark. Then there was nothingness. Terrible, empty nothingness. "Agent Evans! Evans! You awake?" A muffled voice called to him from across the tenebrous cellar. His skull throbbed from a searing pain that radiated from the bloody impact point at the rear of his head to just behind his eyes. Full consciousness had not yet returned to him, however. Even in this fogged nightmare, he knew it was Grigsby that called out to him. He tried to shake off the daze and return to his feet, but it was no use. If the weakness and tremors were not enough to keep him slumped onto the floor, then the ropes and duct tape surely were. He struggled only for a moment before realizing it was futile, and consigned himself to conserving his energy in the off chance a backup call had gone out prior to the floor collapsing. As his senses returned, Agent Evans became suddenly aware of the putrid smells assaulting his nostrils from an area of the room unaffected by the sudden cave-in from the firefight. His eyes had still not fully adjusted to the dark, but he could see what he assumed was Grigsby working at either a workbench or table. In the far right corner stood a massive object covered by a cloth. The sound of Grigsby's tools ceased as his imposing figure turned to face him. He approached with slow, heavy footsteps, then crouched to meet his gaze. "Oh, finally awake, I see. Good. I really didn't want you to miss this." His deep voice, tinged with a hint of excitement, echoed through what remained of his workshop. "I am sorry I wasn't a better host to you and Agent Lowell. If you two hadn't brought up his theme so early in the conversation, we could have at least enjoyed our coffee. Well, that doesn't matter anymore, does it? I mean, I think the time for pretense has come to an end. Besides, I don't believe Agent Lowell is in any real position to drink anything." Evans felt his heart sink. He struggled to move once again, but he still couldn't break the binds that held him in place. "Grigsby, where's Agent Lowell? What have you done?" His questions fell on deaf ears. Grigsby gave him a calm smile, patted him on the cheek, then returned to his workstation. "Called for backup, Grigsby. They'll be here any minute. Don't make this any worse than it has to be. Let me out of here and we can talk." The lies that spewed from his mouth only elicited an amused chuckle from his captor. "Backup? Well, someone should tell them they're running very late. See, you've been unconscious for hours. Look around you, Evans. I have no close neighbors. No streetlights on this road. Hell, did you hear even a dog bark after all that gunfire? No. I'm afraid it's just the three of us." A small feeling of relief washed over Evans. He said 3. Maybe Lowell was still alive and just unconscious. "I'm not a cannibal, you know," Grigsby explained. "Far from it. I loved those people. Well, I loved parts of them. I spent years working at the museum, surrounded by gorgeous paintings and antiquities. But beautiful as they are, something was missing. Then I saw it. I believe you saw it too. The Great Reclamation." Agent Evans shuddered at the mere thought of that painting. "Oh, you didn't like it?" Sadly, everyone's a critic these days. "What you might have thought grotesque, I saw true beauty. Why do you think I took the parts that I did? Imagine a being with the best legs, the strongest arms, the prettiest face, all combined into one ideal human. You know, I used to think my wife was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I was so wrong. Again, I am glad you are here to witness this. This will be the greatest discovery in modern science, coupled with true art and form. I'm truly sorry that you have nothing to contribute to my masterpiece. Your partner, on the other hand, gave me some truly invaluable materials. I just knew he'd be the perfect fit for my work. Now, after you've told me what you really think of my work, I suppose I can use you for concept art, a sketch, if you will. Grigsby snapped on the overhead lights that had not been damaged by the debris. He carefully adjusted them so their beams fell on the blood-stained cover, draped on the thing in the corner. He turned his attention once more to the subdued agent. May I present to you Ideal Beauty, mixed medium. In one quick motion, Grigsby drew back the sheet, revealing the culmination of all of his work. There it hung, in all of its grotesqueness and morbidity. The trim torso of the young swim instructor, Melissa Jarvis, connected to the muscular arms of Hassim Jabal and the toned legs of Amanda Westphal. Above the neck were the skull and ears of Big Papa Crown, with Anna Lau's face and scalp stretched and stapled to fit the much larger bone structure. Agent Evans retched at the sight of this abomination. This amalgamation of limbs and body parts was reminiscent of those things that cheered and bayed around the pile of mutilated bodies in that abhorred painting. Grigsby shot Agent Evans a disappointed glance. Look, I understand that art is subjective, but how could you deny its magnificence? Well, maybe this next part will change your mind, give you a new perspective and a true appreciation for my craft. Dalton Grigsby returned to his work table and retrieved an ancient-looking book bound in dark leather. Though he had never seen it before, Evans knew this was the missing copy of the Liber Sacriritus. Grigsby opened the tome to a page he had carefully marked and began to chant in some otherworldly language. The shouts and screams of his blaspheming grew as it amplified by some unseen choir. The overhead lights flickered and buzzed with each syllable, as if they would soon explode. The foundation quaked and rumbled beneath them as Grigsby finished his incantation. With one final utterance, the horrid creature that once hung motionless began to convulse and shake on its mountings. The ill-fitting body parts writhed and twitched as the sutures and wiring holding them in place strained and pulled in every direction. Its mouth fell open with a disgusting snap, issuing an unearthly howl of pain and terror. Evans closed his eyes as tightly as possible. He could not bear to see this impossible thing, defy all earthly logic and reanimate. Evans? An unfamiliar voice called to him from across the cellar. Agent Evans slowly opened his eyes. The monstrosity gazed at him with an all-too-familiar look, a look that Evans had come to know over the past few years. The monster's steely blue eyes started to well up with tears as it wailed and raged in that subterranean hell. Grigsby began to laugh hysterically, his head down on the bloody work table before him. It was that telling laughter and what he saw next that finally splintered what remained of Agent Evans' sanity, sending him into fits of screams and cries for help. On the wall, just next to where the creature hung, was the body of his partner, Agent Lowell, his eyes and brain neatly removed from his skull.
Deputy Waylon Dupree winced when the first wave of thunder shook his patrol car. It was low and rumbling, as if the earth beneath him were crashing through the canopy of asphalt to take hold of him. The heavy rain came soon after. He struggled against the high winds to stay on the road. Add in some of that telekinesis and telepathy stuff, and you've got yourself something right out of a Stephen King novel. At 21, Waylon was the youngest deputy in the Bidwell County Sheriff's Department in Weldon, Mississippi. Population 109 and a half. It used to be an even 110, but Mervyn Garnell had gone and gotten his legs lopped off while trying to dislodge a raccoon carcass from his combine. As the rookie, Waylon had the sublime privilege of working the graveyard shift in a town roughly the size of your average Walmart.
Lord of Moses, that wasn't no clap of thunder. That was a dadgum standing ovation.
It was almost 2 in the morning, and Waylon was dog-tired. The bottom had dropped out of the rain-heavy sky, and now he couldn't see 2 feet in front of him. He decided to be sensible about the whole exhaustion/biblical flood thing and find a place to pull over and grab some shut-eye. He knew of a car wash about 5 miles up the road on State Road 29, where he could swing into one of those outdoor stalls and nod off till the storm passed. Waylon was well acquainted with the area. He'd grown up in the pinprick town of Blytheville. For well over a century, his kinfolk had filled the graveyards of Weldon and Blytheville and nearby Buckhorn. His family's sweat and bones were in the soil of each of the small farming communities. Everybody knew each other. Most were related in some way or another. As denizens of the peaceful rural life, their biggest concern centered around increasing their crops yields and not accidentally coming onto their cousin in a bar. But there was also the unspoken yearning to run away from the land that absorbed its people like a sponge in a hurricane. The place never quite let you go. It sure hadn't let go of Waylon. Waylon took his time getting to the car wash. This wasn't the time for hot rodding. He pulled into one of the open stalls and killed the old Crown Vic's massive 250 horsepower V8 monster motor. He sank into the well-worn butt crater bequeathed him by his lard-bottomed predecessor, the newly and thankfully retired Big Mick Harvey. Waylon was just about to cross over into Snoozeville, USA, when the booming voice of Deb from dispatch blared from the radio. The fearless female officer was a boisterous, hard-drinking, rough-and-tumble kind of gal, whom the boys at the department clandestinely referred to as Old Glory. The name had come about because each of them claimed to have been on top of her at some point.
Waylon! Oh, Waylon! Boy, are you asleep out there? Just grunt and let me know you're alive.
I'm here, Deb. What's up?
I got a good one for you. You remember old Mabel Luckabee?
Mabel was the stuff of legend in their neck of the woods. She was a mean old cuss who never met a person she could tolerate or a deodorant she couldn't overcome. If cleanliness is next to godliness, then Mabel was the Antichrist. She was now well into her 70s and living alone in her raggedy 2-story farmhouse in Weldon. A widow by vocation, some of the townsfolk opined that her last husband, Ed, had passed away not because of any mishap or disease, but because, like the other poor SOBs before him, he'd wanted to. Not long after, his blue-tick hound dog, Buckethead, decided to go AWOL. Everybody figured, with Ed gone, the dog must have thought, no, you don't, and taken off for parts unknown. Mabel was an equal opportunity offender. She hated everyone, regardless of race, creed, or species. Her scowling moonscape of a face filled Waylon's mind, making him grimace.
What about her?
He asked.
Did she ugly away or something? Darn woman looks like the love child of Steve Buscemi and Elma the Yak Lady. Don't know yet. I just got a call from Doreen, her nosy night owl neighbor. Says she ain't seen her since Monday. That's 2 days ago.
Doreen's tried calling her, but she won't answer the phone. She's also said the house lights have been on the whole time. I need you to do a welfare check. I know she's a pain, so just peek in her window and see if she's moving around.
Can't we just wait a few days to see if the buzzards are circling her house?
Come on now, Waylon. You and me both know two things. One, the buzzards won't go anywhere near her because it might lower their culinary standards. And two, you ain't got nothing better to do.
Deb, the only thing worse than finding that old hag alive would be finding her dead.
Well, if she is, her funeral's gonna draw quite a crowd.
Why? Nobody can stand her.
That's true, but you know what they say. Give the people what they want, and they'll show up in droves. Ha ha ha.
Fair point. All right then, I'm on my way.
The rain had begun to ease off, but the thunder and lightning were still raising a fuss. Waylon was thankful for the graveled lane that led up to the Luckabee house. Otherwise, he would have had to swim for it. After roughly 30 yards of potholes and low-hanging tree limbs, he pulled up to the decrepit old place. Waylon had been there a few times during his childhood to chuck rocks and cherry bombs, but with the storm still laying haymakers, the house looked more foreboding than he remembered. The lengthy shards of white paint that the claws of time had carved away made it look like a large potato that had gone a few rounds with an angry vegetable peeler. Its tattered roof sloped down to rusty gutters from which lush, rambling gardens of weeds flourished. Looming from the blackness, the eerie eyesore brought to Waylon's mind an exterior set from a Rob Zombie movie. Waylon grabbed a small mag light from his service belt, put on his plastic-covered deputy's hat, and jogged to the house's front porch. Its weak structural integrity gave him pause.
This porch makes me think of Mabel. Old, nasty, and sagging in all of the worst places.
Waylon looked through the windows but didn't see anyone. He pounded on the door. No one answered, so he banged harder.
Mrs. Luckabee! Oh, Mrs. Luckabee! Sheriff's Department! Mrs. Luckabee, you in there?
When he failed to get a response, he tried the doorknob. Mabel had left the door unlocked, so he stepped inside. Waylon walked through the house's main floor calling the elderly woman's name,
Mrs. Luckabee!
but all was still and silent.
Sheriff's Department!
With each step, the sticky wooden floorboards groaned as if they were dying. As he went from one disheveled room to another, he was amazed and appalled at the amount of debris that Mabel had hoarded. There were several dozen unopened boxes from QVC, old clothes and magazines, dusty porcelain dolls, and other creepy items that might indicate someone wearing a skin suit was about to come at you with a running chainsaw.
Girl, you are seriously messed up.
As he ventured further into the cramped house, a nostril-searing stench hit him square in the nose.
Whoo-wee! Smells like feet, farts, and Fritos in here.
Waylon headed up the stairs to check out what he figured might be a bedroom, a bathroom, and given the vibe of the creepy dump, a possible kill room. When he reached the second-floor landing, he heard a faint sound coming from one of the rooms.
Mrs. Luckabee? That you?
He followed the noise to one of the rooms and found the door ajar. He pushed it open and saw Mabel lying on her bed. Dressed in a dingy white nightgown, she was propped up on a pillow, staring at a small portable TV located on a dresser near the bed's foot.
Oh, hey, Mrs. Luckabee. You probably don't remember me, but I'm Don and Linda Dupree's boy, Waylon. I come by to check on you. You okay?
Mabel didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. She just kept staring blankly at the TV as if it had hypnotized her.
I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to make sure you're all right. Are you? All right, I mean.
Mabel continued to ignore him, so he walked between her and the TV. She kept looking ahead as if he weren't there. Waylon went to grab hold of her toes and give them a shake, but when he saw the thick curled nails, he poked her foot with the hand-sized maglite instead.
Note to self, destroy my flashlight.
When she didn't respond, Waylon walked around to the side of the bed. He leaned in close to her and whispered,
Mrs. Luckabee? Mrs. Luckabee.
He pushed the side of her greasy head with the tip of his maglite, and she keeled over on her side.
Judas on a tricycle.
Waylon felt for a pulse but found none. Then he heard a faint scratching as Mabel's bottom lip began pulsing outward. He held back his sickness when 2 large brown cockroaches exited her mouth. After pulling in a few deep breaths to quell his disgust, he pressed the talk button on his shoulder radio.
Deb, Waylon here. Pick up.
The radio crackled, and Deb's voice filled the room, too loud for Waylon's taste.
Sup, Waylon? How's the Wicked Witch of Weldon?
Why don't you ask her? She's standing right here.
He chuckled at poor Deb's expense.
Sorry about that, Mrs. Luckabee. I was just...
It's all right, Deb. She can't hear you. She's deader than Kevin Spacey's acting career.
Oh, crap. Really?
Yep. In fact, you can call her whatever you want. She ain't coming.
Well, ain't you nice? Didn't your mama ever tell you never to speak ill of the dead? Though I guess we can make an exception in old Mabel's case. It ain't like she's gonna mind. You know, I don't mean the old cow no disrespect, but the only way I'm gonna be able to squirt a tear during this here tender moment is if I yank out a nose hair.
Whatever. Listen, call in a...
Waylon bent his head away from the radio's high-pitched whine.
Deb, are you there?
Wait. Where? Cut. Get out.
Struggling to communicate with Deb, Waylon retreated downstairs in search of a better signal.
Deb, can you hear me?
He was relieved when she answered.
Yeah, I can hear you, but barely. You keep bobbing and weaving on me. Listen, I've already let the sheriff, know about Mabel. I won't repeat what he called her. He's still on his fishing trip, so he won't be there till almost sunup. I also contacted the first responders down in Camford, but they're at least a half hour out. Said that the storm had caused some trees and power line damage, so it may be even longer. Just sit tight until they arrive. In the meantime, I'm gonna need you to secure the scene and keep watch.
Keep watch? You mean like in babysitting a dead body till the meat wagon and the sheriff arrive?
Listen, Waylon, I know it seems like a big deal when you're new and all, but it'll be okay. Just make sure you don't disturb nothing. The sheriff will take care of the scene. Just go ahead and start your report.
Geez, Deb, of all the corpses to be locked in with on a stormy night, I had to draw Mabel Luckabees.
A low hum came over the radio.
Deb, you there?
Silence. Waylon sighed at first, then decided to make light of his predicament. He held the radio's mic up to his face and announced,
Well, hey there, all you night owls. You're listening to WAYN, where the hits just keep on coming.
Then, like a bad omen, the pounding rain returned with a vengeance. Waylon went back upstairs to check out the rest of the second floor. He was happy to find that the upper floor rooms were not as cluttered and dirty as downstairs. When he finished his exploration, he went into Mabel's room, took out his cell phone, and snapped some pics for his report. Once he got that out of the way, he shut off the TV and headed back downstairs to look for coffee. He was halfway down when he heard a loud click followed by the sound of the TV coming on.
What the heck is that all about?
Waylon re-entered Mabel's bedroom. The old tube television was on, and Mabel's body was propped up on the pillow again. Waylon was unnerved and confused.
Say, wasn't she...
He watched the lifeless body for a few seconds. When it didn't move, he turned off the antiquated boob box, then walked to the door. It was on again. Waylon was adhered to the floor, afraid to turn around. He was relieved to observe that when he did, and with only a tad of guilt, Mabel was still dead as a brick. Waylon figured the mystery had a reasonable explanation, so he shifted into seasoned cop mode. He told himself that all he was dealing with was a prehistoric television, plugged into the wall socket of an old rickety house with suspect wiring.
Piece of crap television,
he thought.
Thing's older than Moses' babysitter.
Waylon reached behind the TV and yanked its cord from the wall, then glared at the blank screen.
Now shut the heck up, or I'm gonna take out my gun and go Scarface on you.
Waylon made his way down to the kitchen and began looking through the cracked, faded cabinets for some much-needed Java. It took a lot of searching, but he finally found an ancient jar of freeze-dried coffee. The jar was sticky, the grounds clumped together like a rich, robust hockey puck. Waylon had guessed that someone had likely purchased the brown muck sometime during the Clinton administration.
Has it come to this? Do I really need caffeine this bad?
Begrudgingly, he accepted that he did. He turned his search toward finding a clean cup, as well as something in which to boil water. He flipped on one of the stove's burners and started digging around. When he saw a relatively clean mug, he lifted it as if he had found a holy grail and sang,
"Ta-da!"
There was a brilliant flash of lightning, followed by a floor-shaking thunder. Then the power went out.
Oh, sweet lady of perpetual nonsense, what now?
Waylon thought. Pulling his defiled mag-light from his belt, he went looking for the fuse box. He didn't have to look for long. There was one located inside the kitchen's walk-in pantry. Waylon inspected the black briquette that was once the main fuse.
Deader than a mean old woman in a farmhouse bedroom,
he thought. Dust and dirt trickled down onto Waylon's hat like grimy rain. The sharp noise came from the room directly above him, Mabel's bedroom. His knocking knees betrayed his fear as his breath retreated into his lungs, refusing to come out. On the one hand, he knew it was his duty to go and check on things, but the other hand was telling him to grab the rest of his body and run like a crack-addled gazelle into the raging night. He settled the internal argument by siding with the more sensible hand. Waylon much preferred braving the torrential rain and sitting in his cruiser to staying in what he was rapidly coming to consider the redneck version of Hill House. In addition, he still needed to fill out a report. He was thankful that the paperwork was in the car, thus affording him a plausible case for reasonable cowardice. When Waylon reached the front door, he tried the knob, but it wouldn't turn. Then, as if on cue, a sinister cackle bled through his radio, making his arm hairs stand on end. He began to fear that a powerful supernatural force might be at play. The idea chilled him. Taking a few steps backward, Waylon warned the silent crowd of imaginary gawkers.
Stand back, y'all. I'm fixing to make a Waylon-shaped hole in this door.
Then an uncomfortable thought hit him.
Oh, for the love of Lucy. The guys at the station will never let me forget it if I run like a little girl from a spooky old house. Gotta tap into my inner Chuck Norris and handle this case like one of the big boys.
He drew what he could from his shallow puddle of courage and ventured back upstairs to inspect Mabel's bedroom again. When Wayland got there, his first act was to locate the source of the noises. Confusion collided with unease as he observed that nothing, including the recently departed Mabel, had moved. However, the lack of activity only served to make him more nervous.
Screw the guys. I'm done with this place.
As Wayland was leaving, the bed spring squeaked, followed by the unsettling sounds of somebody scampering away. He turned around and saw that Mabel was literally dead and gone. His skin tingled at the implications. He shined his mag light around the lightless room, praying that the formerly deceased woman wouldn't come running at him from one of the pitch-dark corners. Despite the massive storm bellowing outside, the world fell silent for Wayland. The weight of his dread submerged his entire mind in a cold black pool of fear and disbelief.
Where's Steve and Elma?
The scratchy voice said. Wayland spun around several times, the flashlight's beam hopping around the room like a bouncing ball of light. Suddenly, bare feet slapped across the wooden floor as the thing rushed into the bedroom closet, slamming the door shut.
Mrs. Luckabee, that you?
The closet door creaked open halfway, and a shadowy figure crawled out. Its neck made a cracking sound as its head swiveled in Wayland's direction. Glowing yellow eyes peered up at him, numbing his quivering body. He focused a funnel of light on the thing dressed in a nightgown. Mabel's contorted body looked like a pretzel playing a game of Twister. Her breathing was quick and shallow, her frame heaving with every pant. As soon as the light settled on her crinkled face, she squealed and scuttled under the bed. Wayland's twitching hand rested on the butt of his service revolver. With great wariness, he plodded over to Mabel's last known resting place.
Why don't you join me down here, Dawn and Linda's boy?
Icy dots spread across Wayland's sweating body like frigid spiders skittering on bare skin. Against his better judgment and basic common sense, Wayland lowered his head toward the floor. Alabaster arms shot out of the mattress and gnarled hands seized him by his hat. Screaming, he twisted his head free of the ghostly grip. Wayland sped from the bedroom and toward the staircase. After a few clumsy steps, his feet flew out from under him, landing him on his backside. Helpless against gravity, he tobogganed down the painful steps, farting loudly with each violent bounce. Finally, his noisy hindquarters found the bottom of the stairs. After pulling himself up, Wayland returned to the locked front door. Grabbing the knob with both hands, he used all his strength to turn it, but his efforts proved fruitless. He pressed the button on his radio.
Damn! For the love of the Lord, please answer me!
The radio was still dead. His next idea was to try to break out through one of the windows. Wayland ran to the living room and tried opening one, but it wouldn't budge. He pushed up on the next one, same result. Desperate, he grabbed a small coffee table and hurled it against the window. It bounced off the glass like a tennis ball. He was about to use his gun to help improve his luck when a coffee mug went sailing past his head, shattering against the impenetrable window. He whirled around and saw the lower back part of Mabel's nightgown disappearing around the kitchen doorway. Wayland yanked the gun from its holster, gripping it tightly in his right hand while holding the mag light in the other.
That's enough now. This is Deputy Sheriff Wayland Dupree. You better make yourself known.
There was a movement in the dining room. He went to investigate. The dust from the many items stacked around the dim room flittered in the bright ray of the flashlight. Waylon's nerves were bouncing around inside him like a pinball. He steered the beam around the room.
I hope you all show up in droves. Quitting time!
Waylon sprinted to the front door, where he fired every round in his gun directly at the doorknob, only to have them rebound off. His heart was racing as if it were qualifying for the Daytona 500.
Let me out of here! Whoever you are, please let me go! I'll jump in my squad car and leave right now!
Footsteps emanated from the front sitting room. Waylon heard the crackling sound of a phonograph needle making contact with the vinyl. An old-school swing-style dance number reverberated throughout the downstairs. He recognized the tune as one his grandma listened to whenever she decided to up the dosage of what she called her happy time nerve medicine. It was an old Judy Garland song from the 1960s called Come On, Get Happy. Soon, Judy's voice chimed in with a bouncy beat.
Forget your troubles, come on, get happy. You better chase all your cares away. Shout hallelujah, come on, get happy. Get ready for the judgment day.
Waylon raised his flashlight, holstered his empty pistol, and entered the dark room. His body became one large icicle. The late Mabel Luckabee, her back to him, stood in front of a large wooden stereo cabinet, swaying in time with the teeny-sounding tune.
Mrs. Luckabee? Mabel? Ma'am?
She stopped moving and snapped to attention. Waylon continued.
The station house sent me here to check on you. You was upstairs dead, but clearly you're feeling better, so I guess I'll be leaving now.
Waylon watched slack-jawed and bug-eyed as the moving corpse levitated and spun around to face him. He aimed the flashlight at the hag, accentuating her face's pallor. Her yellow eyes blazed with raw hatred. His mind was yelling at him to escape, but his body refused to cooperate. He struggled to work up enough spit to speak.
Ms. Luckabee, I just want to leave and...
The shrill sound, coupled with the force of her voice, caused all of the first-floor windows to burst outwards. Her body flew through the air at Waylon. He shrieked, then hurled the maglite at her as hard as he could. Finally, his mind and body got on the same page, and he fled from the flying corpse. Waylon turned and ran straight for one of the paneless windows, launching himself like a twirling meat missile. After landing on the front porch, Waylon rolled into the railing with so much force that his body busted through it and out into the yard. The violent impact made him look like a human bowling ball landing a perfect strike. Just as he was hauling himself up from the thick brown mud, he heard a siren in the distance.
Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus.
The EMTs were the first on the scene. Dave, the long-suffering sheriff, was still on his way back from his ill-fated fishing trip. They found Waylon standing in the front yard, in the middle of the vicious storm, a 1,000-yard stare in his eyes. The team couldn't get anything out of him, so they had him wait in the back of the ambulance while they dealt with Mabel. After 20 minutes or so, one of the paramedics came down to grab some gear and check on Waylon, who was still shell-shocked.
You want to tell me what happened in there? The windows are all busted out and the place is a wreck. Was it like that when you got here?
Waylon was regaining his wits. He realized that there was no scenario in which the paramedics, or anyone else for that matter, were going to believe him. Resigned to his peculiar predicament, he muttered,
Yep.
Well, observations like that fall under your authority anyway, the paramedic said. I'll just go on with my job then.
He began placing items in a small vinyl bag. Before he left for the house, he turned and said,
As soon as we finish up here, I want to take you in for a quick checkup. You look like you might still be in shock. Hell's bells on an Easter bonnet. I thought you boys were supposed to be used to all this stuff.
He had only taken a few steps when Whalen called after him.
Hey, tell me something. Where'd you find the body? Did you see anything unusual?
You mean other than the house being beat to crap? We found her upstairs in bed. She was lying back on a pillow staring straight ahead. Creepy as all get out. She must have known the blackout was coming, though.
Why's that?
She had a small mag light in her hand.
Then he left Whalen alone to ponder his sanity.
Am I crazy? Or did I let my rookie self get so worked up that I started imagining things?
He wondered.
What a wuss.
Whalen had nearly talked himself down off the 50th floor ledge of the crazy building when the radio in the front cab of the ambulance turned itself on. The sound of Julie Garland's mellifluous voice pushed Whalen off the side of his mental skyscraper as she crooned.
Forget your troubles, come on, get happy. You better chase all your cares away. Shout hallelujah, come on, get happy. Get ready for the judgment day.
Chilling tales for dark nights.